Welcome back, and if you are just joining us, welcome for our fourth evening of reflection on Dante, mercy, and the beauty of the human person. I am delighted to introduce our second lecturer, Jennifer Newsome Martin. Professor Martin is a brilliant scholar, as well as an assistant professor in the program of liberal studies with a concurrent appointment in the Department of Theology. A systematic and historical theologian, she focuses on 20th century Roman Catholic theology, particularly Trinitarian and eschatological discourses, theological aesthetics, religion and literature, Catholic retrieval, and the nature of tradition. That's about everything. Professor Martin's recent research engages the religious character of modern philosophical thought, particularly the German idealist and romantic traditions, as well as pre- and early Soviet-era Russian religious philosophy. She is the author of Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Critical Appropriation of Russian Religious Thought from the University of Notre Dame Press, 2015, which studies the relationship between modern speculative Russian religious thinkers and the aesthetic, historical, and eschatological dimensions of the theology of Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. Her work has also appeared in several journals, including Modern Theology, Horizons, Spiritus, Church Life, and Christianity and Literature. Forthcoming essays in various edited volumes include such topics as Sophiology in von Balthasar, French Catholic ressourcement theology, and modern poetry and apocalyptic. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jennifer Martin for her lecture entitled Geographics of Stars, Metaphysics of Light, Theological Aesthetics, and the Form of the Human Life in Dante's Paradiso.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Also want to thank Father Pepper for that wonderful lecture. We didn't talk ahead of time, but there's a lot, I think, of interesting resonances between our papers, which is fortuitous. So that's good. I'll start with a bit of an introduction, a little biographical information on why I am talking about stars so much. I like stars, but so I grew up on a very small farm in North Carolina. Past the one stoplight of the tiny town, past the places where the paved roads all ran out, past even where the gravel roads flattened out into dirt ones. My brother and sister and I grew up on 40 acres of fields and creeks among a whole menagerie. Pigs and horses and flocks of quail, honeybees, a one-legged turkey that would fetch a stick, I kid you not, dogs, both wild and tame, snakes, deer, kittens and cats, foxes, and enough chickens to supply eggs for us and all of our nearest neighbors, if there were any neighbors to speak of. There weren't. Living so deep in the rural Carolina Piedmont, our nights were not invaded by any artificial urban light that would obscure the night sky. So when my brother got a telescope, we became very well practiced at recognizing and naming the constellations. The Big Dipper of Ursa Major, Orion's Belt, the brightness of Polaris, the North Star, which provided direction and beginning, a place from which we could map the rest of the sky. I have a memory from one summer night when I was about 7 or 8, made softer and probably more strange from the 3 decades that have passed since the event which gives it form. My whole family was sprawled out in the clover and the dirt in the backyard just before midnight, watching a near-apocalyptic meteor shower, which you can really only see from rural places. As I watched these stars burn their passes overhead, I remember distinctly feeling a dizzying strangeness, a reversal in perception, where it felt as if the stars were the really real, and we, creatures, sitting there, so fragile, so minuscule as to be nothing. I did have the same, and I blame Lenny for this, not altogether unpleasant feeling of simultaneous dwindling and expansion when I watched All Creatures Give Praise, the digital planetarium program in the Digital Visualization Theater. Have you seen that? Many of you? Okay. I witnessed this giant scope of the universe and our very modest place in it. But when that feeling of sheer contingency hit me at the age of 7 or 8, it was as if the whole world and beyond the world had opened up. It was as beautiful, maybe evoking Otto, as it was terrifying. The impression of that memory I have retained is that I had glimpsed the memory of something, the mystery of something I found then and even now to be truly inarticulable. The more I saw, the more I wanted to see. And it was as if time had stopped altogether. At the very least, I had seen something beautiful, and it took me out of myself into that oddly expansive feeling. It's certainly true that children have a natural knack for this attentiveness to beauty that adults have to work so hard at recovering. A few months ago, for instance, my 4-year-old daughter, Mary Frances Clare, was looking out of the car window on the way to school as the sun was just coming up. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, and the beams of the sun were illuminating the clouds with a strange and a bright magnificence. Apropos of nothing, she said, "I like looking at that beautiful sky. It makes my heart feel big." I want to argue this evening that Dante's Paradiso is very fundamentally a text about this very kind of seeing, but to the nth degree. It is a poem about beauty, about a pedagogy of beauty that leads the pilgrim upward to more and more and more expansive vision. It is aesthetic through and through, and not simply because the visionary language and religious symbolism of the poetry itself is beautiful, though it is that. The text is hyper or meta-visionary because it details the processes and operations by which human beings see, or as the case may be, fail to see. Furthermore, it is aesthetic because it bears the structure of the revelatory, that which is inside or underneath, that mysterious hidden depth, is given expressive form, even if, as Dante admits ultimately when he reaches the Empyrean, the expressive forms, art, language, even his own imagination and memory, are ultimately insufficient for the mystery of absolute being that luminously informs them. In this joyful season of Eastertide, my comments tonight will attend mostly to Dante's transcendent visions of the Paradiso, although I do skip the moon spots, in which the narrative shuttles toward the nearly unbearable luminosity of the vision of God through the enormous distances of astronomical imagery. Though these dream visions require from both Dante and ourselves a transformed way of seeing, even at its most imaginative or visionary, the text never abandons such aesthetic concepts as form, proportion, perspective, and so on. Indeed, Dante's ascent up through the planetary heavens is observed not by the announcement of quantifiable spatial coordinates, but rather significantly with greater and greater increases in Beatrice's effervescent beauty, until they reach the Empyrean, and Dante must admit that her beauty is such that it cannot even be described. But Dante's admission of his artistic limits is significantly not a refusal to look, nor, as it turns out, even cause for Dante to abandon the poetic form at the same time that he is protesting its insufficiency. At the end of the poem, having reached the Empyrean, Dante writes, quite poetically, you'll note, of Beatrice, "The beauty I saw there transcends all measure of mortal minds. I think only her maker can wholly comprehend so great a treasure. Here I concede defeat. No poet known, comic or tragic, challenged by his theme to show his power, was ever more outdone. As feeblest eyes struck by the sun go blind, so the remembrance of my lady's smile strikes every recognition from my mind." From the first day I looked upon her face in this life to this present sight of her, my song has followed her to sing her praise. But here, I must no longer even try to walk behind her beauty. Every artist, his utmost done, must put his brushes by. If the artist must lay his brushes by, the poet must also put down his pen, and yet he does not or cannot. So tonight, I want to explore a few of these aesthetic themes that will turn out, I hope, also, maybe even first, to be theological. Perhaps, if we are very lucky indeed, if the stars align, they may even turn out to be edifying as well. I'll introduce my topic by considering the themes of ocularity, of sight, and blindness as they are presented in the Paradiso, especially as correlative to his symbolic presentations of light and darkness. Then I will explore a few aesthetic terms. First, we'll take a brief look at form and proportion. Dante's universe is governed by a deep sense of order and fittingness. It is important to understand how that element is operating in the text. Secondly, I want to talk about space. I'm cheating here a bit, I'll confess, because under this term, I'm actually smuggling in two ways of using the language. That is, I want to talk first about astronomical or astral space, outer space, but allow that to inform a conception of aesthetic space, namely, how visual space can be conceived or configured by an artist. This discussion of space will lead into the third concept of perspective. The Paradiso, of course, forces Dante and also the reader herself to adopt a number of dizzying changes of point of view as Dante undergoes his tremendous ascent to God, presenting a number of puzzles in the astral journey about the relationship between the seer and the seen, the subjective and the objective. Finally, I will conclude with a liturgically appropriate turn to what Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar has called the phenomenon of seeing with resurrection eyes, and that's his language. We'll start with the discussion of the operation of sight and its failures in the Commedia as a whole, though the theme is very fertile and it will be impossible to do anything other than skate along the surface. Like any mystical or quasi-mystical allegory of spiritual ascent worth its salt, here Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses, which Father Pepper brought up already, springs to mind, as does Bonaventure's Itinerarium. The themes of seeing and blindness, darkness and light, operate on polyvalent levels. There's more than one way to be blind, and there's more than one way to see. So when Dante mistakes the giants and the titans in the Inferno for a city with high towers in Canto 31, Virgil gently chides him, saying, "You are still too far back in the dark to make out clearly what you think you see. It is natural that you should miss the mark. You will see clearly when you reach that place how much your eyes mislead you at a distance." This example of misperception seems to be just a straightforward failure of the senses. The deep circles of hell are just too dark, being at the core of the earth and as far as possible from the metaphysical light of the sun. And Dante is just too far removed from the object of his sight to make out what it is that he truly sees. The Paradiso, however, complexifies the categories of seeing and blindness. Dante's temporary blindness in this part of the text is often accompanied by an oversaturation of light, an arresting glimpse of glory, a beauty so terrible sometimes that it impedes the senses even with a degree of violence. This text is always telling us that learning to see is a therapy, a gradual refining or strengthening process, witness to changes in Dante's perception by oscillations of partial sight, misapprehensions, or even outright blindness. Near the beginning of the astral journey in Canto 3, Dante sees on the moon the dimmed faces of those who have broken their vows, the inconstant. But here his perception is again deceived. Seeing the pale dimness of these souls' faces, he mistakenly thinks that what he is seeing is merely a reflection, as in Narcissus's pool, or, if you will, through a glass darkly, and so glances behind him to try to see the genuine article. Here, Beatrice corrects him, saying, "Even now you dare not trust your sense of the true fact, but turn, as usual, back to vacancy." On many, many occasions in the Paradiso, though, Dante temporarily loses his capacity for sight because of an excess of glory. When the essence of the Holy Spirit is glimpsed between the sun and Mars, when he sees the vision of Christ triumphant, formed in the great constellation in the sphere of the fixed stars in Canto 23, and again in Canto 25, when he stares too deeply into the radiance of love that is St. John the Apostle. Furthermore, as Dante goes on his visual journey, the culmination of which is a transcendent vision of the beauty of the Godhead that he can neither describe fully nor remember, the early and middle stages of his vision are not unmediated. Rather, much of what he sees is not as such, but instead glimpsed immediately in the reflection of the eyes of Beatrice. In Purgatorio 31, after Dante has drunk from the waters of Lethe so he would forget and be purified even from the memory of his past sins, Dante has a first beatific vision in the earthly paradise after the four cardinal virtues lead him not to look at the thing itself, but rather at its reflection in Beatrice's eyes. In this case, it is the Christologically inflected twin natures of the one person in the figure of the griffin. Likewise, in the opening canto of the Paradiso, Beatrice stares directly into the sun. No eagle, Dante writes, ever stared at its shining with so fixed a gaze. Though he tries to follow suit, he must look away from the brightness of the vision and see the scene play out instead upon her shining eyes. These mysteries of the faith cannot come to Dante, then, in their undiluted strength, without the steady work of assent that would fortify his senses. In Jupiter, the great singular eagle, composed of the many souls of the just rulers, explains to Dante that he can overreach in his quest for greater sight. It is possible to want to see not only too little, but also too much. Evoking God's whirlwind speeches in the book of Job, the eagle speaks thusly in response to Dante's question about the nature of divine justice. "Therefore, you understand our way of seeing, which must be only one ray of the mind that permeates all matter and all being, cannot by its very nature be so clear, but what its author's eyes sees far beyond the furthest limits that to us appear. In the eternal justice, consequently, the understanding granted to mankind is lost as the eye is within the sea. It can make out the bottom near the shore, but now on the main deep, and still it is there, though at the depth your eye cannot explore." It is probably not an accident that just a few cantos later, in 21, Beatrice must withhold her smile from Dante in the planetary sphere of Saturn. Here she likens Dante analogously to the antique character of Semele, who begged to see Zeus in the fullness of his divinity. There's more to that story, but that's enough for now. But when he first became manifest, she was destroyed by fire, since a mortal form could not look upon Zeus and live. The canto goes, "She did not smile. Were I to smile," she said, "you would be turned to ash, as Semele was when she saw Jupiter in his full godhead. Because my beauty, which as it goes higher from step to step of the eternal palace, burns, as you know, with ever brighter fire. And if it is not tempered in its brightening, its radiance would consume your mortal powers as a bough is shattered by a bolt of lightning." Eventually, however, as his senses are refined and strengthened, Dante is able to behold Beatrice's smile, even in an unmediated way. Once he has recovered from his swoon at seeing, there's a lot of swooning in Paradiso, by the way. He saw the brilliant splendor of Christ triumphant, the radiant substance blazing forth so bright, above 1,000,000 lights. Beatrice invites Dante to look upon her as she is. Open your eyes and turn them full on me. You have seen things whose power has made you able to bear the bright smile of my ecstasy. As one whose senses have been stricken blind by a forgotten vision comes to himself and racks his wits to call it back to mind, such was I at that summons, my spirit moved to a thankfulness that shall live on forever. Finally, in the great Canto 30, Dante must stoop to drink from the river of light, the river of divine grace. Yet the method of drinking is not with his lips, but rather with his eyes. Once he has allowed the river of divine grace to sate the thirst of his eyes and wash away the last of his mortal and moral frailty, the scene around him almost magically blossoms into full relief. The colors deepen, the vision sharpens, and he sees, even now in the reflection of God's tremendous light, the mystical rose that is the image of paradise. There is thus in this text a kind of shattering force that is necessary in Dante's pedagogy of beauty, as pilgrims are purified and drawn up toward true vision, which, as we shall see, is less a seeing and more of a self-forgetful participation in the triune, indeed perichoretic light of God. Let's turn briefly to an exploration of proportion. Lenten readers of the Inferno and the Purgatorio will have seen that horrible exactness by which punishments or penances are meted out in Dante's rather ironic calculus, according to which the consequences fit the crime with an aesthetic perfection. Dante's heavens are also highly proportional and hierarchical, although a little less exciting, announced in the very first tercet of Canto 1 of the Paradiso. So proportion. The glory of him who moves all things rays forth through all the universe and is reflected from each thing in proportion to its worth. In this first canto too, Beatrice reiterates the aesthetic language of form and proportionality. There is a fittingness that governs the order of Dante's universe, an ontological form which comes from God as the creative ordering principle of all things. Beatrice goes on in an almost humorously patient explanation to her charge about his sudden ascent from the earthly paradise to the heavens. She sighed in pity and turned, as might a mother to a delirious child. You can just imagine her patience. The elements of all things, she began, whatever their mode, observe an inner order. It is this form that makes the universe resemble God. In this, the higher creatures see the hand of the eternal worth, which is the goal to which these norms conduce, being so planned. All being, within this order, by the laws of its own nature, is impelled to find its proper station round its primal cause. All of creation, then, is ordered to a proper end. Human beings, however, as free agents, are the only ones that can swerve from the form of their proper end, which is God, and can fail to accord their lives to this form enjoined upon them. Beatrice says, it is true that oftentimes the form of a thing does not respond to the intent of the art, the matter being deaf to summoning. Just so, the creature sometimes travels wide of this true course, for even when so driven, it still retains the power to turn aside, exactly as we might see the heaven's fire plunge from a cloud, and its first impulse may be twisted earthward by a false desire. God, as the form of forms, however, attracts to God's self what is like, and the journey of the saints, and our own journeys too, are toward greater and greater approximations of this eternal form, even if, as Dante concedes, the creature sometimes travels wide. As Canto 29 tells us too, to all the primal light sends down its ray, and every splendor into which it enters receives that radiance in its own way. We see this hierarchy enacted in the Paradiso, as the radiance of the saints is correlative to their degree of beatitude, but this is a non-competitive kind of relationship. So we can see the paleness of the inconstant saints of the moon over against the brilliance of the higher souls like St. John the Apostle. These are saints who have achieved various degrees of transparency to God, such that the luminosity of God can illumine them according to a proper proportionality. We'll return to this idea. But now let's turn our eyes to the heavens and think for a moment about space. First astronomical, and then aesthetic. How first does astronomical space function in Dante's poem? Even the casual reader can see it. The stars are everywhere, even in the Inferno when they're absent. Virgil in the Inferno is able, even in these pits of hell, to rely on the stars to navigate their journey, reading from their hidden positions the day and the time. One enormous clue to the fundamental importance of stars in Dante's poem is that the word stella, or star, is the closing word of all three sections in the Divine Comedy. In the Inferno, after Virgil and Dante make the treacherous climb over the body of Satan trapped in the ice of the ninth circle of hell, they emerge from the darkness. And here are the final lines from the Inferno. He first, I second, without thought of rest, we climbed the dark until we reached the point where a round opening brought in sight the blessed and beauteous shining of the heavenly cars, and we walked out once more beneath the stars. Again, at the end of Purgatorio, after Dante drinks from the waters of Lethe and is purified, he writes, I came back from those holiest waters, new, remade, reborn, like a sun-wakened tree that spreads new foliage to the spring dew in sweetest freshness, healed of winter's scars. What an Easter image. Perfect, pure, and ready for the stars. Finally, at the very end of the Paradiso, after Dante has gazed into the luminous mystery of the Godhead in a beatific vision that he can neither describe, articulate, or remember, he writes, here my powers rest from their high fantasy, but already I could feel my being turned, instinct and intellect balanced equally, as in a wheel whose motion nothing jars, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. The stars and the planetary bodies provide both the content and the architectonics of the poem. They are signals of God's grace, expressions of God's glory, intimations of hope, promises of a fuller light. They are symbolic in the Purgatorio of the four cardinal virtues, prudence, fortitude, justice, temperance, and the three theological virtues, of course, faith, hope, and love, the latter of which shine in the night sky to communicate mystically to the purgatorial souls spiritual progress when active progress during the night is not possible. In Canto 10 of the Paradiso, Dante reads in the orderliness of the constellations, reflections of the creativity of the divine Trinity, seeing especially in the equinoctial point, he's really geeking out about stars right now, where the celestial equator intersects with the sun's ecliptic, the perfection of creation. In short, and this is a lot easier probably to think of it this way, the Paradiso might be considered as a very long footnote to Psalm 19:1. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Now you'll be singing that, right, from the song. Moreover, it is also relevant that in my discipline, in the liberal arts, the discipline of astronomy, as the apex of the secular curriculum in the quadrivium, shares that border, which may or may not be permeable, with the discipline of theology. So Dante's astral journey through the 7 planetary heavens can thus be read allegorically as a pedagogical pilgrimage through the liberal arts toward theology, which in the Paradiso gives way to a sort of mystical theosis or participation in God. On Giuseppe Mazzazza's analysis, the trivium maps onto the lower planetary spheres of the moon, which is grammar, Mercury as logic, Venus, Eros as rhetoric, that makes sense, and the quadrivium onto the upper planetary spheres. Mars, the god of war, is aligned with music. You have those warring notes that are resolved into harmony. Jupiter as geometry and Saturn as astronomy, which opens out onto the heavens of the fixed stars, the primum mobile, the immaterial heaven of the Empyrean. It is in the Empyrean, too, that the stars give way to the magnificent, eternal Easter dawn of morning, whereas Canto 30 describes it, a star or two begins to fade from the eyes of watchers here below, and heaven puts out its lamps one by one till the loveliest two must fade. Glory to glory indeed. The second kind of space I want to talk about is aesthetic. How it, like astral space, is conceived, ordered, and experienced. How is it exactly that we see and interpret spaces? This is really an enormously complex question, a more sophisticated treatment of which could bring many other disciplines to bear, including the science of optics, art history, anatomy, psychology, and so on. While I will gesture a bit imprecisely toward some of these discourses, my main interest in the question is really theological. If it is true, as I have suggested already, that the Paradiso is a fundamentally aesthetic text about the human capacity for and operation of sight, one of the first questions that emerges for me is, what constitutes the relationship between the seer and the seen? So, visual objects present themselves phenomenally as perceivers look at them. So something definitive and objective is given in any given visual field. Objects do not simply spring into existence at the moment of seeing and then disappear when we look away. But certainly in perception, the subjective element is not absent. Rather, in vision, the objective and the subjective interact in a mysterious way. Recall, for instance, and I hope you do, the optical illusion of the dress. You remember this? Okay. Which broke the internet for a time last year, and which may have strained some relationships, including between myself and my husband, between those who clearly perceived this garment as white and gold, and those who clearly perceived it as blue and black. White and gold, obviously, but we'll let the matter rest. So, a more serious example from art history might illuminate this discussion on perspective a bit further. Let's consider for a moment the phenomenon of perspective in art that gives the perceiver the illusion of depth, even against a flat surface of a canvas. Standing in the London National Gallery, for example, in front of this very famous painting by Jan van Eyck, it is easy to think we might even step through the canvas, avoiding the dog, into the room like Alice in Wonderland going through the looking glass. German Renaissance painter Albrecht Dürer helpfully draws attention to the etymological roots of the word perspective. Perspectiva, he says, is a Latin word which means seeing through. Artistic perspective thus allows the viewer, in a sense, to look through the flatness of a canvas into a space that does not actually exist physically, transforming the opaqueness of the canvas's picture plane into a kind of window. Now, this manner of conceiving artistic space with a central vanishing point here in the mirror, where you can sort of see the expertly reflected backs of these two figures. This is what modern eyes are accustomed to seeing, but it's not necessarily the natural or the only way of conceiving an artistic space. In his classic and sometimes contentious 1927 text on geometrical or mathematical perspective, perspective as symbolic form, Ernst Panofsky explores the development of this manner of perspectival construction all the way from antiquity to modernity, arguing that the shifts in artistic perspective were actually relative to particular cultural moments that comprise any given Weltanschauung or worldview. In classical antiquity, for example, Panofsky suggests that aesthetic space was constructed not as unified or mathematical in any way, where figures would be sized according to the perspective of the beholder, but really distorted and flattened out, juxtaposed simply with other figures in an unsystematic overlapping, without any great interest in representing bodies and the spaces between them to scale according to a perspective, or a fixed perspective. That is, there was no convergence in these antique images toward a single vanishing horizon. In Renaissance conceptions of aesthetic space, however, when developments in perspective began to correct the distortions of ancient art, the space becomes rationalized, made highly mathematical, a development which for Panofsky is more ambivalent than not, though it is still instructive for our purposes. So what's interesting to me about this is that the objective planes of the painting upon which figures are placed accounts first for the eye of the art's perceiver, the person standing in front of the canvas, which is represented here by the apex of the point in the diagram, the eye of the person looking into the pictorial plane. Indeed, it is the centrally located eye that determines the position of the figures in the painting. So the lines are correlative to the beholding subject, who perceives the figures in the painting as far or near relative to their particular vantage point. Here the perpendicular lines converge on a vanishing point based fundamentally upon assumptions of a central, fixed, homogeneous position of an eye. Later developments in Renaissance art culminate in the game-changing discovery of the infinite vanishing point, upon which all orthogonals or perpendicular lines converge. Panofsky recognizes this development of infinite mathematical extension in art, which resonated with the Renaissance and early modern overreaching of the rational, as a de-theologizing of the universe. He argues, however, that artistic perspective like this is a double-edged sword, something that opens out onto the realm of the visionary, where the miraculous becomes a direct experience of the beholder, in that the supernatural events erupt into his own apparently natural visual space and permit him to internalize their supernaturalness. Perspective, he goes on, seems to reduce the divine to a mere subject matter for human consciousness, but for that very reason, conversely, it expands human consciousness into a vessel for the divine. These observations raise supremely interesting questions about the phenomenon of sight, here both aesthetic and theological. How, if at all, should an artist account for the subjective perception of the viewer? Should the lines of a painting be dictated based upon where the observer is standing, or rather generated from within the logic of the painting itself? In short, should aesthetic space be determined by the object or the subject, or somewhere in between? Panofsky offers a comparison between two similar works of art that depict St. Jerome in his study, to elaborate on this point further. The first is Antonella's da Messina's St. Jerome in his chamber. As we can see, this painting is very strict. It's architectural. It looks as if the front plane has just been sort of cut off. It's objective. It's governed by its own laws of symmetry that do not really seem to account too much for the beholder. So that's number one. Number two, which is probably more famous, is Dürer's St. Jerome in his cabinet. The painting, in distinction from the first, seems to invite the spectator in, the spectator seems to be standing a bit to the left, right? You can see the vanishing point, which is eccentric. We imagine, as Panofsky says, we ourselves have been admitted into this painting because the floor appears to extend under our feet. The entire eccentric position of the central vanishing point reinforces the impression of a representation determined not by the objective lawfulness of the architecture, as in the first, but rather by the subjective standpoint of a beholder who has just now appeared. So what happens, do you think, when the theologically attentive reader, like ourselves, translates this whole discussion of an artistic perspective back to Dante's Paradiso? The first thing that reading the Paradiso allows for, I think, in terms of our literary and theological reflection on this kind of space, is a kind of imaginative thought experiment. What happens to aesthetic perspective when the perceiver, standing in front of a canvas in a museum, moves neither slightly to the left or slightly to the right on a horizontal plane, but shuttles upward at great velocity away from the Earth, which in the text geocentric worldview was the center of the universe, through the concentric heavens of the moon, the planetary heavens of the fixed stars, and so on. We glimpse something of this phenomenon, I think, on at least two occasions, when between cantos 22 and 27, Beatrice instructs Dante to cast a retrospective glance down toward the earth. So in Canto 22, after Dante has conversed with Saint Benedict, and before they advance to the fixed stars, Beatrice says, "Therefore, before you enter further here, look down and see how vast a universe I have put beneath your feet, bright sphere on sphere. Thus may you come in the fullness of delight to the triumphant court that comes in joy through the round ether to your mortal sight. My eyes went back through the 7 spheres below, and I saw this globe, so small, so lost in space. I had to smile at such a sorry show. Who thinks it is the least pebble in the skies, I must approve. Only the mind that turns to other things may truly be called wise. This is Dante's version of going to the digital visualization theater, right? To see this globe so small and lost in space. So, from Dante's heightened perspective, the earth is minuscule, no more than a mote of dust in a ray of sun, seemingly of little importance. What he calls in that same canto, that dusty little threshing ground that makes us ravenous for our mad sins. But with the proper perspective in place, that which might seem in the ordinary course of our lives to be hyperbolically important is appropriately regulated to adiaphora, indifferent things, that need variously to be slothed away altogether or else refined on that human pilgrimage to beatitude. But surely Dante, the esteemed poet who dared soar to the heights of heaven in what Balthazar has called the, quote, inconstant, surging, unstable ocean that is the vernacular, does not mean to suggest that the earth and the particular people who populate it are of no importance whatsoever. Obviously, history matters for Dante. Historical particulars and identities are brought up even into heaven. In Canto 17 of the Paradiso, Dante's own great-great-grandfather, Cacciaguida, is able to see, from his point of view, the whole span or form of Dante's life, past, present, and future, unfolding in earthly history, contingently, even as it is present with all of historical time in the mind of God, as in a single, dense vanishing point. Another element of the text that mitigates against the deformative notion that the earth and the bodies within it are nothing is what I found actually to be one of the most moving moments of the Paradiso, especially in the season of Easter. What I have in mind here is Canto 14, when Solomon tells Dante that the only thing that will make the flames or luminous effervescences of the souls even more beautiful is precisely the sublime reunion of these glorified souls with their transfigured, resurrected bodies. When our flesh, Solomon says, made glorious at the judgment seat, dresses us once again, then shall our persons be more pleasing in being more complete. Bodies, then, when transparent to light, are not adiaphora. The second thing we might notice, especially with respect to the relative quotients of subjective and objective perspective in the Paradiso, concerns Dante's perception of the souls of the blessed. In Dante's astral space, the paradisal souls appear variously to Dante as humanoid figures in the early stages and as flames or radiances in the latter. But they are not always visible. They are not subject to the normal laws of mortal perception. Rather, very much like the resurrection appearances of Christ in the Gospels, who chooses whether and how his figure is seen or not seen, the souls manifest themselves freely to Dante in a volitional and loving act of accommodation to his senses. Indeed, even when the souls manifest themselves in the various heavenly spheres in accordance with the nature of their beatitude, they are not really there, since they reside eternally in the immaterial heaven of the Empyrean. Now, this marks quite a change from those beleaguered souls of the Inferno, who were compelled not only to act out these grotesque indignities correlative to their earthly offenses, but what I think is perhaps worse, to enact such nightmarish scenarios necessarily as the objects of Dante's curious gaze. In short, then, what Dante sees in the Paradiso is less dependent on his own subjective perception and more upon the objective reality of the freely given appearing phenomena of the souls. Now, this transition from the relative privileging of the subjective to the objective also seems to be enacted on a macro scale in this whole text. So those of you who have heeded Pope Francis's counsel to proceed through the entire text from Lent to Easter may have noticed that the opening lines, we've already looked at the closing lines, so let's look at the opening lines and see what that tells us. The opening lines for each section marks a bit of a tonal shift, a move from subjective to objective. That famous opening of Canto 1 of the Inferno certainly is marked by the subjective, not least because of its reliance upon all that first-person language. It's Dante's own subjective perspective that determines the scope of the action. Midway in our life's journey, I went astray from the straight road and woke to find myself alone in the dark wood. Likewise, the opening few tercets of the Purgatorio see Dante announce his intentions for a second book as he prays to the muses for poetic inspiration. But in the very first tercet of the Paradiso, which we've already looked at, Dante himself is totally under erasure, as the objective givenness of the refracted light of divine revelation takes on a full and commanding precedence. The entire canvas, if you will, is totally determined by the metaphysical light of God that moves and informs all reality. Dante does not insert himself into this first tercet at all. The glory of him who moves all things rays forth through all the universe and is reflected from each thing in proportion to its worth. Now, even when Dante does shift back into the subjective in the second and third tercets, it's only to make an admission of the failure of any possible expressive form, knowledge, poetry, imagination, or memory, to capture with any success the mysterious experience of the beatific vision. He writes, I have been in that heaven of his most light, and what I saw, those who descend from there lack both the knowledge and the power to write. For as our intellect draws near its goal, it opens to such depths of understanding as memory cannot plunge within the soul. Further related to this question of perspective, and most important, I think, is Dante's culminating vision of the mystical rose in Canto 30. So remember when we were talking about the paintings, perspective as correlated to the subject is meant to give an impression of depth, the appearance of relative farness or nearness as the viewer stands before a canvas. In this vision, however, Dante's limited first-person perspective magnifies, growing more expansive, such that farness and nearness are no longer even relevant categories of vision. Lines which do recall Picarda's insistence in Canto 3 that the blessed do not aspire or strive to rise up through the ranks of heaven, since their will is already at one with the will of God. Nor were my eyes confounded by that sea and altitude of space, but took it in all, both number and quality of that ecstasy. There, far and near cause neither loss nor gain. For where God rules directly without agents, the laws that govern nature do not pertain. Indeed, as Christian Maves details so expertly in his text, The Metaphysics of Dante's Comedy, the final revelation of the light of God, who is the concentrated actuality of being itself, dissolves this distinction between subjective and objective, between God and the self. It's a sharing of space. As he contemplates the mystery of how the finitude of human being might, as imago Dei, come to participate in the Trinity, the perichoretic love of Trinity, Dante likens himself at this moment to a geometer who's halted over the impossible mathematical puzzle of how to square the circle. But here there is no rational principle to hold on to. As Professor Maves puts it, quote, the understanding comes in a flash of illumination or experience, canceling concept and image, and with them the last trace of autonomous desire and will, which are now integrated into the harmony of creation, into the experience of self in all things as the self-expression of divine love. Subjective and objective perspective have here merged mysteriously into one mode of beified perception. We see from the Paradiso that it is God, very God, who is the infinite vanishing point of the human life, to recur back to our discussion on the paintings. I hope it is not making too much of the analogy to draw attention to the fact that in the ninth sphere of the Prima Mobile in Canto 28, Dante has a dazzling vision of God, precisely as a non-dimensional infinite point of light. Just as a man before glass can see a torch that burns behind him and know it is there, before he has seen or thought of it directly, and turns to see if what the glass has shown is really there, and finds as closely matched as words to music the fact to its reflection. Just so, as I recall, did I first stare into the heaven of those precious eyes, in which, to trap me, love had set his snare. Then turned and turning felt my senses reel as my own were struck by what shines in that heaven when we look closely at its turning wheel. I saw a point that radiated light of such intensity that the eye it strikes must close or ever after lose its sight. In Dante's imaginative vision of the Paradiso, the infinite vanishing point is the luminous Godhead, being itself, in which objective and subjective perspective becomes unified. The space, as Father Pepper already suggested, decidedly shared all the way down. Contemplating the increasing hierarchy of the light of the stars, which gives way in the Empyrean to the full light of divine being, has drawn the pilgrim steadily upward with its undeniable summons to purity, to virtue, to vision. In heaven, Dante aligns absolutely the human being's subjective perception with the objective givenness of the Trinity in a non-linear, even non-dual miracle of the perspectival, where God is all in all, and there is no longer any need to insist upon our own subjective space. Furthermore, that fantastic line here in this canto, that love has set his snare, sends the reader back to Virgil's early counsel in Dante in Purgatorio 18, regarding the summoning force of love, which moves the pilgrim to beatitude. Availing himself of the aesthetic language of form that points forward to the Paradiso, Virgil says, "The soul being created prone to love is drawn at once to all that pleases it, as soon as pleasure summons it to move. From that which really is, your apprehension extracts a form, which it unfolds within you. The form thereby attracts the mind's attention. Then, if the mind is drawn to it, that summoning force is love." Readers of Paul Claudel's long philosophical play, The Satin Slipper, which I imagine are probably not the majority, might be reminded here of what I think is the most striking, visceral image, namely the guardian angel's fishhook that's lodged in the human heart, that tugs us upward toward the beautiful, sometimes quite painfully, as you might imagine, with an invisible fishing line. In the play, the angel poses the question to Donna Pruheza. If he hear a violin somewhere, or simply 2 or 3 times in succession those taps one gives on a piece of wood, you yourself tell me, is it really true that you have never felt in the depth of yourself, between the heart and the liver, that dull thud, that sharp pull up, that urgent touch? In Dante, it is the vanishing point of primal love that sends what will become Claudel's fishhook all the way down to Dante, midway through life's journey, in the reason of Virgil, the compassion of the Virgin Mary, the divine light of St. Lucia, the revelation of Beatrice, pulling him further up and further in. As we conclude our Easter reflections on Dante's Paradiso this evening, I'd like to think for a moment about the pedagogy of beauty. That is, learning to see aright as a spiritual therapy. For we poor souls gathered here are not, of course, in heaven yet. Dante, too, had to come down from such great heights and live out the anguished experience of exile from his beloved Florence that his ancestor Cacciaguida had foretold. We conduct our lives not from these heights of the heavens, but more tentatively, in the reality of a fragmentary vision that is conditioned always by our finitude. We might consider then, in light of Dante's visionary pilgrimage through space and time, adopting the spiritual practice of cultivating our vision according to what might be called an optics of resurrection. In his book, The Whole and the Fragment, Balthasar alludes briefly to this image of resurrection eyes, which I think is an absolutely fascinating concept to layer onto our Easter readings of Dante. According to Balthasar, the human being shares in the resurrection, quote, only through a daily wasting away of his own nature. He gains the necessary power only if he is daily assimilated to Christ through grace. Earthly men often fail to recognize the risen Lord. They walk along talking to him without seeing the person that is speaking to them. Resurrection eyes are not implanted like a natural organ. They are imparted through the act of seeing itself, through the event in which the old tomb is burst and the new truth springs forth. To see with resurrection eyes means to see with an always doubled vision, to see the rays of God in all things. It means to take with equal seriousness physicality and the everyday and that invisible reality which both suffuses and transcends them, to see with this double vision both form and splendor. It might mean, too, a capacity, if not to see, at least to imagine the form of the whole coherent narrative of our lives laid out, complete, seen from above, and thus to accord ourselves spiritually to the form which summons us. Moreover, it might mean practicing the ascesis of self-forgetfulness by looking with great mercy upon each other as we are. That is, correlated ultimately to the light and love of the God who moves all stars, the one in whom we live and move and have our being. We are as St. Paul says we are in the second letter to the Corinthians, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. Thank you.